Good afternoon. We welcome everyone to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at our regular weekly briefing. Let's start with the events of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Today, literally at this moment, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry receives the Secretary-General of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, who is visiting Moscow on a working visit. The agenda of the meeting provides for a discussion of issues of further strengthening of the SCO and comprehensive improvement of its activities in modern conditions. In the context of Russia's current chairmanship of the Council of Heads of Government of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member states, special attention will be paid to practical steps to deepen trade, economic and humanitarian cooperation, and, of course, there will be an exchange of views. As a matter of fact, it is now being held on topical international and regional issues. And on January 28, under the chairmanship of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the next general meeting of the Commission of the Russian Federation for UNESCO will be held with the participation of heads of relevant Russian departments, heads of constituent entities of the Federation, representatives of the media, business and scientific circles, prominent figures of culture, education and sports. According to tradition, the Russian foreign minister will assess the current state of cooperation between Russia and UNESCO, and a number of commission members will also speak. The participants of the meeting will discuss plans for the development of cooperation with the organization in the future. Well, the relevant decisions will be made based on the results. Another important information within the framework of our diplomatic work, our country's diplomacy and foreign policy within the framework of the course approved by the President of the Russian Federation for the development of long-term and mutually beneficial cooperation with the states of the African continent and the relevant instructions of the head of state, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our country, in close contact with interested federal executive authorities, is systematically working to expand the network of Russian diplomatic missions in Africa. The opening of Russian embassies on the continent meets the mutual desire with African partners to bring our multifaceted cooperation to a qualitatively new level. And this task was enshrined in the relevant documents, the final documents of the Russia-Africa summits of the 19th year in Sochi, the 23rd year in St. Petersburg, as well as the first ministerial conference held in Sochi last November. We are talking about a form of partnership between Russia and Africa, and in the 23rd year, as a matter of fact, the Russian embassies of Burkina Faso and Equatorial Guinea began to function, and next in line is Niger-Leon, where we are talking about the resumption of activities, which, unfortunately, was discontinued in 1992nd year. Then it was done for financial reasons. We are also talking about the establishment of a new diplomatic mission in the Republic of South Sudan. The relevant orders of the government of the Russian Federation were issued at the end of December of the 24th year, and the official opening of the mentioned diplomatic missions is planned in the near future, which we will also inform you about. And, I hope, we will even invite you to the opening. And now the situation around the Ukrainian crisis. First of all, of course, it is necessary to cite the facts of another, so to speak. Once again, confirming the terrorist nature of the Kyiv regime, the civilian population of our country continues to be terrorized by Ukrainian neo-Nazis. It is not enough to name the atrocities and outrages of crimes committed by them. In fact, these are inhuman manifestations of the basest vices. On January 17th, in the basements of residential buildings of the Russian settlement liberated by the Russian Armed Forces, Russian police of the Kursk region found torture chambers arranged by the APU. Mutilated bodies of at least 7 local residents of different ages, with traces of bullying, were found in them. Bandera crime threw grenades at the unfortunate. The most detailed comment was posted on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia on January 19th. Our specialized specialists, in particular Ambassador-at-Large Miroshnik, also commented on this situation. Demonstrative footage of the interrogation of two captured ISU militants who killed a peaceful woman in the Kursk border area was posted on social networks. They explained their crime by the fact that they received an order from the commanders to shoot all Russian-speaking residents. I would like to remind you that international humanitarian law prohibits both giving such orders and carrying them out. What these inhumans are doing is beyond everything. We have repeatedly drawn the attention of international human rights structures to such horrific cases. This is worse than a terrorist attack. It's worse than a crime. It's a combination of all the basest things, as I said. We will seek the adoption of appropriate measures and decisions by these structures. On January 17th, wounded volunteers were injured on the Vasilyev-Shirokaya highway in the Zaporozhye region as a result of a targeted attack by a Ukrainian drone on a civilian bus again. They were transporting humanitarian aid to the frontline areas, and we must pay tribute to them, because this is the very space near the frontline areas. It is extremely dangerous. And despite the fact that people, I mean volunteers, could not do this, avoiding the risk, they still continue to provide assistance, because they see it as their duty. They just can't do it any other way. On the 17th to the 20th of January, 11 civilians were wounded as a result of the shelling of civilian infrastructure, residential sector of Horlivka by the AFU, including with the use of cluster munitions. And on the morning of the 20th of January, militants in the ISU, a few minutes before the start of classes, purposefully fired at a secondary school in the village of Backfire. This is the Kherson region. They fired at the school from the multiple rocket launchers of HIMARS. This terrorist attack. You know, they often say that this is a cruel cancer of the tarantula, that there are some others, but only if you know. Committed with special cynicism, in his life, 2 people, at least 25, including 4 children, were injured. There are 3 of them, including a girl born in 2008 year. He is in serious condition. Now, I would like to say, and I really admire the work of our law enforcement officers, to say about the punishment for the crime of the Kyiv regime. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for war crimes. An American citizen, Patrick Thomas Critt, was sentenced to 13 years in prison in absentia for participating in hostilities on the side of Ukraine. This so-called soldier of fortune previously served in the tactical intelligence units of the National Guard, infantry, and amphibious units of the United States. He was repeatedly sent on business trips to Central America, the Middle East. The punishment of 14 years of imprisonment in absentia was imposed by the Latvian mercenary Volmers and Ulmanis. All of these foreigners have been put on the international wanted list. The completion of the terrorist attack in the Kursk region against Russian servicemen and civilians, from 15 to 16 years in prison, were previously detained Ukrainian militants Anatoly Voloshin, Vladimir Arshulik, Sergei Karev, Alexander Doichik, Snovy Sigarovich, Andrian Kulbaba, and Oleg Vovk, 3 militants from the Ukrainian Paramilitary Nationalist Association Azov, Yevgeny Lavrenko, Dmitry Lysenko, and Denis Fedorka, have been sentenced to 24.5 years in prison. They systematically shelled civilian objects on Russian territory. Ruslan Nagyalev of Azov received 24 years in prison. The investigation found that on the 4th of March of the 22nd year, he, following the criminal order of Commander Arsen Dmitryak, opened mortar fire on residential buildings and socially significant object of Mariupol. As a result, 2 civilians were killed. The criminal admitted his guilt. Let me remind you that Arsen Frick was previously sentenced to life imprisonment in absentia. Russian law enforcement agencies continue to work to bring to justice coronation Nazis and foreign mercenaries for war and other crimes, and we will inform you about it. Well, regarding those who are the spotters, curators, who encourage the Kiev regime to further crimes. On January 16th, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer visited Kiev. Unlike his predecessors, after taking office, he delayed coming to Ukraine for a long time. Therefore, his unplanned visit caused a lot of speculation about the true intentions of London. Many experts agreed that this was an attempt by some globalists to keep the situation in the right direction for themselves and prevent the launch of a peaceful scenario of events. As the US President-elect Trump, who has already assumed his powers, has repeatedly stated before, supporters of the so-called war party on both sides of the Atlantic turned out to be seriously alarmed by the intention of the current US authorities to achieve an early end to the conflict. Why? Yes, because the achievement of peace is not included in their plans. Another order paid for another. In this regard, analogies are not freely suggested by the events of the spring of the 22nd year, when, following the results of the next round of negotiations held in Istanbul on March 29th, Russia and Russia-Ukraine were close to reaching mutually acceptable agreements that opened the prospect of concluding a peace agreement. Then, on the orders of the American so-called hawks, the then British Prime Minister Johnson rushed to Kiev urgently. He banned Zelensky from further negotiations and demanded the continuation of the war in order to achieve a so-called victory over Russia. As it was said, everything must be decided on the battlefield. What this turned out to be for Ukraine is well known to everyone. You know, I drew attention to the absolute kind of narcotic madness that was going on in Davos. I mean all these speeches by Zelensky, his communication with the media, with delegates and so on. And this includes his statement, his reasoning that what happened in the spring of the 22nd year cannot be called a negotiation process and negotiations, because allegedly the wrong thing was discussed there. And why was he silent all this time? And what did Zelensky not say before that? What prevented me from saying for 3 years that these were not negotiations? And what prevented then, in those days, to declare that this is not a negotiation? And then, why did they ask for them? After all, he asked. He also sent delegates there, who, by the way, then, when they got back to Ukraine, got shot. Remember, yes, those who participated in these allegedly from Zelensky's point of view are not negotiations. Here, it means that his current speeches in Davos were also written under dictation. I mean under the dictation of these British fabulists, in order to once again throw another disse into the international information space, in order to lead the world community on a false trail. And the negotiations were allegedly not negotiations. And allegedly, as you remember, memories burst out here recently, they did not dissuade him. But before that they said that they dissuaded him. In general, everything is clear. The main thing is that there should be no peace from the point of view of these supporters of the war party and, first of all, representatives of the Anglo-Saxons. One of the main events during Keir Starmer's visit was the signing of an agreement between Britain and Ukraine on a centennial partnership. Well, we have already commented on this. It was a message from January 18th. It is posted on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today, I would like to briefly dwell on how this document is perceived. In fact, in Britain itself, the English media emphasize that the agreement, I say again, is an assessment inside the foggy Albion. It is there that experts evaluate such agreements. So, I will emphasize again, English journalists, English columnists, English political scientists write that the agreement is just a beautiful gesture and nothing more. Take a look. The publication believes that the direct quote public hugs of Sir Keir Starmer and Zelensky have a symbolic meaning, and also reassures that, direct quote, you do not need to pay for it. The new partnership between Ukraine and Britain does not provide for any new funding commitments from London. End quote. While still speaking in Kyiv, the British example stated, again, a direct quote, it's not just here and now, it's an investment in our two countries for the next century, end quote. Pathetic, but about nothing. And it is very similar to the rhetoric of Chamberlain, who, returning in September 1938 year, after the Munich collusion with Hitler, told his fellow citizens that, direct quote, he brought peace for a whole generation. Well, it looks like it. And what generation? What kind of world? And they already knew then how it would end. Well, at least, as it will develop, they didn't even know how to end. They didn't bet on the Soviet Union. But where everything will go, and what should go to the east of Hitler's offensive, that's what it all came down to. Just to remind you, less than a year after Chamberlain's statement that he brought peace for a whole generation, Britain entered World War II. Maybe London will finally learn that indulging the Nazis is criminal. They do not lead to good, and lead to exactly the opposite results than stated. And now about the plans of the collective West. The intention of the new American administration to shift the costs of maintaining the Nazi Kiev regime to its European satellites forces them to hastily exit from the current situation. The meeting of the defense ministers of Britain, Germany, Italy, Poland, and France, which took place on January 13th in the Polish New, was dedicated to this, and the participants pointedly emphasized their determination to overcome the difficulties of the current moment and continue providing assistance to Ukraine. There were few specifics, though. Basically, the so-called declarations of intent sounded. At the same time, the ministers came to the conclusion about the underutilization of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex and the need to develop joint ventures on the territory of Ukraine itself. I am developing this idea. German Defense Minister Pistorius, who arrived in Kiev on January 14th, noted that by providing Ukrainians with their technologies, German partners will benefit from the military experience of the Ukrainian side. By the way, according to the figures announced by Zelensky himself, the APU uses 40% of American-made weapons. The remaining 60% in equal parts is its own European military products. In this context, we drew attention to the circulating reports about the Westerners' plans to deploy their troops to ensure, as they put it, the implementation of any peace agreement. On January 16th, the British media wrote that British Prime Minister Starmer and French President Macron held closed-door talks in early January on sending military units of the two countries to Ukraine, direct quote, as part of a potential peacekeeping mission. And on January 18th, in an interview with the publication, the German defense minister, did not rule out the same options for sending German soldiers to Ukraine for, direct quote, ensuring the security of a certain demilitarized zone, subject to a ceasefire. I would like to remind you that the intervention of NATO forces in Ukraine threatens an uncontrolled escalation of the conflict and is categorically unacceptable for Russia. And now about the desertion of the APU. According to Ukrainian media reports, the problem of desertion has also noticeably worsened in the armed forces of Ukraine recently. In the 24th year, in connection with the unauthorized abandonment of the unit, almost, just listen to this figure, 89,500 criminal cases. That is, under 100,000 people. These are only criminal cases that are recorded. They simply deserted from the Ukrainian fields. Since the 22nd year, Ukrainian military enlistment offices have put on the wanted list more than 500,000 Ukrainians, the scandal around the 155th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Anna Kyivskaya does not subside. Its number is more than about 5,000 people. Almost half of them passed special training in France in the autumn of the 24th year. After completion, several dozen militants voluntarily left the location of the training center and left for Europe. The remaining part, according to various sources, from 1,000, called 900 people, to almost 2,000 people, did not reach the front and preferred to simply desert, and this despite the fact that 930 million euros were spent on training the brigade. Do the same Europeans who actually pay for all this know about this? Of course, no one from the high stands tells them about this in their countries. So we perform a space bar. A similar situation was observed in the Polish Poznana. There, 13,000 of those who were trained voluntarily left the landfills. I mean, out of 13,000, 1/10, 1,300 people of the Ukrabanderites left their places of location. I'll emphasize it again. These are the ones who did not reach the front, and these are the Ukrabanderites who were just being trained. Meanwhile, the assistant to the American President for National Security, Oli, from January 12, in an interview with BBC News, pointed out that Ukrainians could quite independently solve the problem with the shortage of personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine by lowering the mobilization age to 18 years. In Kyiv, all this has already been fixed and taken under the visor. It is reported in social networks that the military enlistment offices of 16-year-old Ukrainian youths are forced to sign, as it is called, the consent of a citizen to undergo military service. On January 9th, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine adopted, in general, as follows: after reviewing the amendments to the law on military duty and military service, providing that Ukrainians abroad will be able to register remotely now not from the age of 18, but when they turn 17. The document is also introduced from the current 25th year for 18-year-old students and their peers who did not enroll in universities received basic military training and basic military service, respectively. The first one will be equated to the second one. At the same time, Ukrainians under the age of 25 will allegedly not be subject to mobilization yet, but we hear and see where it all goes. And there is no doubt that it is a matter of time. Zelensky's regime will sacrifice hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainians for self-preservation without delay. Once again, please note that Zelensky was most outraged when he was talking in Davos now, invitingly, heartrendingly telling that allegedly in the 22nd year it was not negotiations. He was very worried about his own fate and his own person. He cared about it, he didn't even hide it. And all this will be done, and the age will be lowered, and the next hundreds of thousands will be the objects of these Ludolevs, for the sake and to satisfy the interests of Western curators. But the struggle in Ukraine is being waged, as we have said repeatedly, not only with the citizens of Ukraine, but also with monuments, with religion. The Kyiv regime continues to struggle with the historical, general cultural and moral code of the Ukrainians themselves, fraternal Ukrainian peoples. Look, on January 15th, the Odessa City Council demanded to demolish the memorial plate installed on the territory of the St. Archangel Mikhailovsky convent, in honor of whom? Who didn't arrange it this time? In honor of the sailors of the Russian submarine Kursk. Let me remind you, they died in the 2000th year. Why is there this stove? Yes, because some of the sailors were Odessans, and these did not hesitate to destroy the plate to their compatriots. On the night of the 31st of December, the 24th, on the 24th, well, from the 24th to the 25th year, the coronation Nazis dismantled the monument to Vladimir Vysotsky installed in Odessa in the 12th year. He was at the building of the Odessa Film Studio. They did it just spitting on the opinion of the residents of Odessa, the residents of the city themselves. They just did it by intimidating the protesters. How did they bully them? Very simple. They said that the SBU will deal with you. The authorities of Odessa seemed to have little scandalous decision to demolish the historical landmark of the city, the monument to Pushkin on Primorsky Boulevard. On the 17th of January, they got their hands on the so-called Pushkin plane tree growing nearby. It was included in the list of geographical objects, whose names contain a symbol of Russian imperial policy. That's what it's called. The tree, without imagining it, has survived many, but until the 25th year it had no idea that it was a geographical object, and not a botanical one. So far it has not been cut down, but it has been renamed. Now it's a Western sycamore tree. He wants to ask, is he a Western plane tree on all sides? Maybe from the East and East. The struggle of Ukrainian chauvinists against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is taking increasingly absurd forms. But the government of the country has approved a draft regulatory act defining the procedure for closing religious organizations which, direct quote, propagate the ideology of the Russian world. These may include parishes whose names contain the names of saints, as it was said, of Russian origin. This, this is generally something beyond logic, reason. This is psychiatry already. Here, for example, is Prince Alexander Nevsky. According to Bankova, he poses a threat to the national security of Ukraine. No. By the way, I believe in it. Because after all, Alexander Nevsky has been canonized, is a saint, is so revered, and so, I think, it is unlikely to be indifferent to look at what is happening. But in order to fight it by demolishing monuments, only the mentally ill could reach this point. The head of the State Service for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience of Ukraine, there is such an institute, Zelensky, said that the authorities are going to make demands for a name change by the parish of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which are founded in the name of saints, it was said, of Russian origin. Well, why not a sex change, for example? Well, in general, we can talk about any requirements here. In fact, they will be forced to abandon the heavenly patron. Based on what? To demand that the saint show his passport and see what is written there, in which city, under which czar or sovereign he was born, in which language he spoke. Otherwise, the state threatens to deprive the wrong parish of registration in court. I think it is. This would be the envy of Saltykov-Shchedrin, Gogol, Bulgakov. Them, Zoshenko, of course, Ilf and Petrov. I think none of them could even come close to the level of absurdity that they described in their usual works. But what is happening now in Ukraine has surpassed any of their, even the most ingenious finds. These facts once again confirm the actual special military operations on denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, elimination of threats emanating from its territory. It was announced by the Russian leadership. All of these goals will definitely be fulfilled. Well, now about the life of NATO members. On the 15th-16th of January, a meeting of the Military Committee of the North Atlantic Bloc was held in Brussels, at the level of the Chiefs of General Staff. We had questions from journalists asking them to comment on this. Traditionally, the focus of the discussion was on Russia. Secretary-General Mark Rutte and the head of the Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, habitually frightened their colleagues in the alliance with the Russian threat. They declared the need to prepare for the conflict, that is, to switch, as it was said, to a military way of thinking. But before that, I wonder which one it was, when they all shouted like a carbon copy that only on the battlefield they should decide everything at the negotiating table. They also urged not to increase military spending, implement regional defense plans, and continue to help Ukraine, which the West in fact uses simply as a battering ram against Russia. There were arguments of the same paranoid nature about China, Iran, and the DPRK. Well, all this of course does not surprise us. Let me remind you that NATO is a power tool of the collective West, and when I didn't stop, not only preparing for wars, but most importantly fueling conflicts around the world. Bauer proudly stressed that a direct quote at the meeting table gathered thousands of years of military experience. Apparently, he probably wanted to say 1,000 years of military experience led by the United States, but was ashamed. And this, Bauer said, is, direct quote, absolutely unique in the world. Of course, it's hard to argue with this. No one has such experience of waging wars, brutal colonization, plundering foreign countries, as the collective West. NATO allies, in fact, are still trying with all their might to maintain their hegemony in the world, to exclude the strengthening of alternative centers of power and development to the West. And in this context, they lure countries from other regions into their orbit, promising financial assistance, support, and then turning them into their satellites. By chance, the chiefs of the General Staff were invited to a meeting in Brussels. A record number of partner countries were invited, according to the calculations of the organizations. Now there are 26 of them. The scheme of the alleged NATO cooperation does not change. First, the partners are convinced of the need to reform the defense and security sectors, and of course they provide assistance in this. Specifically in this area, why do they gradually impose NATO standards? And then they begin to act from within the armed forces, law enforcement agencies. Through education, they form a pro-Western elite. How such experiments end, such partner assistance is well known. Interference in internal affairs, changes in foreign policy, imposing their pseudo-values, dictating coalition attitudes, and then everything according to the plan of plunder, destruction of the national code, identity enslavement, exploitation. We call on the countries participating in the events, in this event, which have not yet completely bogged down in the NATO web and have not had time to swear to serve the interests of the so-called Golden Billion, to remember in their own national interests, and think about whether it is worth linking their fate with the military bloc, which has decades of aggression, wars, conflicts, destroyed states, millions of civilian casualties. Yes, and I would like to announce one more event. On January 28th, at 11 o'clock in the morning in Moscow, the press center of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will hold a briefing here by the ambassador-at-large of our department on the crimes of the Kyiv regime, Mr. Miroshnik. A summary report on the crimes committed by the Kyiv regime in the 24th year will be presented. The event will be held in an online format. The broadcast will be carried out on the website of the Russian Foreign Ministry, in social media accounts. Translation will also be provided in Russian, English, French and Spanish. And for accreditation issues, please contact the press center. Contact information will be posted on our website. And, by the way, there is another topic related to NATO. We are talking about the Baltic Sea. There were also many questions about the fact that NATO is increasing its activity in the Baltic Sea. The Atlantic Alliance is using, as we have already recorded, any opportunity to build capacity near the Russian borders at a specially created regional summit of NATO member countries on January 14th in Helsinki. It was stated, as it was said, about the special danger of the so-called shadow fleet. They formulate it this way for our country. They will come up with endless news stories. The North Europeans decided to identify seriously and stop attempts of sabotage against critical infrastructure. It was also announced large-scale measures to strengthen control over the water area and the underwater situation, verification of insurance certificates, development of new monitoring technologies. The launched NATO Baltic Sentry mission, which is related to the latest incidents on underwater cables between Finland and Estonia. Allegedly, this whole scheme, this company or this mission, is designed to protect the underwater infrastructure, and, at the same time, the alliance, which is going to send warships and planes, submarines, as well as marine drones to the Baltic Sea, as part of the mentioned operation, absolutely ignored the possible consequences of such activity for a fairly dense navigation in the region, where the situation is already tense. What does this mean? It is obvious that the steps of the North Atlantic Alliance are primarily aimed not at improving security, but, as they formulate it, at containing our country. We are talking about an attempt, uncoordinated with Russia by other interested international partners, to create artificial barriers to navigation in the Baltic, which some in NATO unreasonably want to make their own, as they have already announced, an inland body of water. It's not like that. The Baltic Sea has been, and remains, a common space for all countries of the region without exception. From a legal point of view, freedom of navigation operates in the waters of the Baltic Sea, outside the territorial seas of coastal states, which implies the possibility of ships and ships under any flag being located there, the stopping of foreign vessels, their inspection, detentions, or other measures of interference in the navigation of a vessel in these sea spaces, is possible only on a specific short list of grounds, such as piracy, illegal fishing, and, by the way, the protection of underwater infrastructure are not included in it. Accordingly, I would like to remind NATO members that, in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982 years, for the implementation of coercive measures against a foreign ship in the economy, the zone needs the permission of its flag state. Interference in navigation in the entry of a vessel cannot be based solely on discriminatory, unilateral restrictive measures, unfounded suspicions, and simply a desire to find the so-called Russian trace. They can come up with anything, but we are talking about the right now. Of course, we will closely monitor the situation in the Baltic Sea, respond appropriately to abuse by ships and member states of the alliance, and, accordingly, comment on all of this. There are a lot of questions, but I think, for obvious reasons, it came to us in connection with the controversy that unfolded around Greenland. We heard a statement from the United States and heard a statement from Denmark, but it seems to me that in these statements, and in the comments of these statements, the main thing is missing, the essence of the issue. He talked about everything, about purchases and sales, about sums of money, about forms of separation, connection, association. Anything was said. Let's see what the whole story is about. I would like to recall some pages of Greenland's history related to Denmark's colonial policy and the American military presence. As a matter of fact, this explains what is happening now. Copenhagen, striving to completely subjugate Greenland, in the not very distant past, purposefully engaged in the destruction of the unique ethnocultural identity code of the indigenous population. The practice of forced contraception of Greenlandic women has become a gross violation of human rights by the Danish authorities. This practice was mainly used, well, you probably think there, I don't know, 100 years ago, 200, no, not 100 years ago, forward from 1960 to 1970s, according to the estimates of the media, the appropriate means. I won't list them. I think it won't be difficult to find it all, or we will definitely make a link to the relevant material. They were installed for half of the entire female population of the island. The appropriate procedures were simply applied to them in order to stop the opportunity for them to become mothers. In such an absolutely inhumane way, Copenhagen has achieved a reduction, and in some villages, up to zero birth rate among the indigenous inhabitants of the autonomy. Thus, the Danish authorities. After all, you need to understand, it wasn't some kind of erroneous experimental story. It was a purposeful policy to destroy the local population on an ethnocultural basis. And the Danish authorities expected to save money. Think about it. Why was everything done? Well, there's a lot of land. Please live. Why do all this? Why did Copenhagen need this? That's the whole point here. The Danish authorities expected to save money on financing kindergartens, schools, and the healthcare system. More than 140 Greenlandic women have filed lawsuits against Denmark demanding compensation. Prime Minister Greenland Aegis called these actions genocide. Copenhagen has not officially apologized. The Danish authorities practiced forcibly removing children from Inuit families and transferring them to foster families of Danes, without the knowledge and consent of their parents. For what? These are also their experiments. In order to form Greenland's elite loyal to Denmark. One more time, it's not 100 years ago. It's not in the distant past. It's not about barbarians. Well, basically about barbarians, but this is about modern barbarism. It was during the lifetime of people who today are called people in the prime of life. It was all observed by generations of living people and became victims of it all, or simply were not born. According to the victims, the children were forbidden to speak their native language. Does it remind you of anything? And isn't this the answer to the question why Danya is so frantically supporting Zelensky, who wants to clean up the territory, part of the territory? Well, before a part, now probably the entire territory of Ukraine, is from people who speak Russian. For violating this requirement, I mean for violating to speak in their native language, the Danish authorities were punished. At the end of the so-called social experiment, most of the children were unable to reunite with their families. They were placed in orphanages. It was they who carried a colossal psychological trauma, and today, a number of lawsuits have been filed against Denmark for violations of the European Convention on Human Rights, demanding compensation. Danish international experts have repeatedly pointed out the facts of infringement of the rights of Inuit by the Danish authorities, including restrictions on their access to medical and educational services, housing. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Francisca Coltso, and following a trip to Greenland in February of the 23rd year, called on Copenhagen to address the problems, direct quote, of the negative impact of the colonial heritage, which is expressed in structural and systemic racial discrimination of the Inuit. Significant damage to Greenland and its indigenous population has also been caused by those who now speak out in favor of changing the status of Greenland. This is the US military presence on the island. For many years it was carried out without the consent, without the control of the Greenlanders. Forced relocation became a manifestation of complete disregard for their legitimate interests. When, you might also say, well, probably 100 years ago, when there was nothing related to human rights. But no, why in the 50s? Several families of whites from places of ancestral residence, in connection with the construction of the US Air Force Base Tula on the territory of the autonomy. Now it is Patufic, the decision on resettlement, which the Supreme Court of Denmark in the 2003 year characterized as a direct quote, expro. The expropriation seizure was taken without, of course, any free prior special consent of one kind or another. There was no agreement at all. There was no consent of either conscious or unconscious Inuit. The issue of paying them appropriate compensation, as you can guess, has not yet been settled at all. The prolonged presence of the US armed forces in this region, I mean Greenland, caused significant environmental damage to the island. In particular, it is confirmed in the conclusions of the Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on Human Rights and Hazardous Waste, published in 2018 year, the masked Tutanchik in 1968 year, the plane crash in the area of the Tolya base of the American strategic bomber B-52 with 4 thermonuclear bombs, caused radioactive contamination of the area. Tons of hazardous waste have been buried at military facilities abandoned by the US armed forces, including the last Chem-Century base operating at a nuclear reactor, which pose serious risks to the environmental safety of Greenland. And the increased intensity of Copenhagen's promises to ensure a bright future for the island as part of the kingdom, both in terms of significant expansion of autonomy rights and economic development, is not credible, and given the many years of experience of colonial exploitation by Denmark and by the United States, it is not surprising that Greenland strives for independence and the formation of an independent state. And now to the question of this very neocolonial ideology, on the example of the violation of the rights of the Serbs of Kosovo, because a ruthless campaign continues there to sweep the autonomous region of Kosovo-Metohija from the Serbs by the hands of the self-proclaimed Pristina authorities, the so-called, with the connivance of Washington and its EU allies, forced Albanization is being carried out. Any forms of autonomy of the Serbian community are being destroyed, which seek to deprive everything, up to the attributes of national, religious identity. The main obstacle for the provisional self-government bodies in Kosovo is the largest party of Kosovo Serbs, the Serbian List, which, by the way, is the only one capable of resisting massive violations of the rights of the Serbian population in the upcoming February 9th elections to the regional so-called parliament. That is why at first they tried to prevent the party from registering, and now they do not allow its observers to join the territorial election commissions. That is, they mock as much as possible. It is obvious that the so-called Prime Minister of Kosovo Kurti intends to falsify the results of the vote to the detriment of the Serbian list in order to seat puppet figures loyal to Pristina in parliamentary seats. But it is also clear why this is being done. Thus, conditions were created for the redrawing of local so-called legislation to meet the needs of antiseptic purges, aggressive Pano-Albanian plans. Such a scenario is fraught with the most monstrous consequences for the Serbs living in the region, and it directly threatens the stability of the entire Balkan region. The situation on Earth is complicated by the frequent raids of the regional police, the so-called brutal demonstrations against employees of uncontrolled Serbian administrations. Again, the 21st century is in the yard. Cruel demonstrative repressions are designed to increase fear among already intimidated citizens, morally break them, force them to leave their homes. The responsibility for unleashed terror courses lies entirely with the countries, of course, from the West. They publicly portray discontent with their wards, but in reality they encourage his criminal policy and participate in erasing the traces of the century-old Serbian presence in Kosovo. Does it remind you of anything again? Of course it reminds me. We call on the international mission deployed in the province, on the basis of Resolution SCO 1224, to responsibly fulfill its mandates, in the interests of protecting the Serbian minority, with unconditional respect for the territorial integrity of the Republic of Serbia. The most important date, and how perversely those whom we consider unfriendly state regimes treat it. On January 27th, we will celebrate the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp by the soldiers of the Red Army, their rescue of the surviving prisoners. Soviet soldiers died fighting for this camp and the polished city of Auschwitz. In total, Almost 1.5 million people died at the hands of the Nazis in this concentration camp. They were tortured and sent to the gas chambers. Others died of starvation as a result of medical monstrous, terrible, catastrophic experiments, the vast majority of them Jews, but there were representatives of dozens of other nations. The tragedy of Auschwitz remains the most terrible reminder of the Holocaust, of the Nazi war crimes during the Second World War. In 2000, the United Nations declared the 27th of November, the day when the Soviet Red Army liberated this concentration camp, the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of the Holocaust, so that this was the basis of the decision to unite forever the memory of the victims and those who stopped this dehumanization and violence. What do we see today? The memory of the victims seems to be preserved, but it cannot be separated from the memory of those who stopped the violence and saved people from extermination, because then this memory will be erased. Tragic symbolism also lies in the fact that in recent years, the organizers, the main participants of mourning events on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, are representatives of states that vote against or abstain from voting on the General Assembly resolution combating the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other types of practices, and so on. You know this resolution. First of all, of course, we are talking about Poland and other countries of the collective West that support the neo-Nazi Kyiv regime. I would like to ask a question, and not rhetorically at all, and what will they celebrate then? In Poland, the term liberation was replaced with the entry of the Red Army into the camp territory in relation to this event. Of course, there was definitely an entry, but the characteristic is important. It really was liberation at the cost of their lives. How many Red Army soldiers died there? This is the falsification of history. Until recently, they claimed that he had been released. However, a few years ago, they said that it was not the Red Army soldiers who were released, but the Ukrainians. Since the units belonged to the 60th Army of the First Ukrainian Front, of course there were Ukrainians there, but most of them were Russians. Only the problem is not in nationalities. The problem is that then they did not divide themselves by nationality. First of all, they called themselves soldiers of the Red Army, with Soviet people. There were Russians and 37 other nationalities of the Soviet Union. And our country always says that there is one victory for everyone. We do not share it. It's shared. But as you understand, it was possible to mention everyone, since only Ukrainians are mentioned, in particular Polish comrades. You could have mentioned everyone else, but no. The organizers will not thank and list everyone. They have a different task because, not that there's not enough time. They need to freeze out everything positive, everything heroic, everything real of the Red Army. They need to denigrate it as much as possible. To do this, everything is logged in, one nationality is being withdrawn, including in support of the political conjuncture. Everyone else is given oblivion. It is noteworthy that the German Jew Otto Franco, the father of the famous Anne Frank, wrote in his first letter to his mother that he was released and was leaving. What nationality? He writes it. We don't invent it. Russians. Then Soviet soldiers were Russian for everyone. And again, this is not paranationalism. This is about the fact that people of nationality who were on the right side of history, who were on the side of good, they did not divide each other by nationality, performing feats, liberating. People were divided by nationality, just those who were on the side of evil. That's where they were. I wonder if Franco's letter, in particular, will not be rewritten after our briefing today, or can they? I would not be surprised if some regular US ambassador makes a mistake again and writes in social networks about the release of Americans from Schweiz. This has already happened, by the way. The museum on the site of the camp, let me remind you, appeared in the first post-war years. Since 1979, he was added to the list. Very important. UNESCO World Heritage Site. Since 2000 of the 14th year, the powers to organize events on the 27th of January were transferred by Warsaw from state structures to the museum. They really wanted to find a way not to invite the Russian leadership. Museums, instead of sending out official invitations, seem to inform those whom they deem necessary about the planned events. What kind of museum is this? What's his? What kind of organization is there in this museum? This time, the embassy of the EU member states and the states supporting the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation. They were informed, and the others. I want to remind you that in the 2013 year, Russia contributed $1 million to this museum. As a result, we did not receive any information. This once again refers to the question of a world order based on fake rules. They write themselves, they violate themselves, because there are no rules except one, the right of a strong limitless. By the way, or maybe it makes sense to discuss the behavior of the museum as an organizer of commemorative ceremonies within UNESCO, excluding from the invited delegations of other museums that took part in the preparation of its exposition. And I'll explain what is meant. The Russian Victory Museum on Poklonnaya Hill has made a permanent composition in block number 14 of the museum at Auschwitz-Birkenau. In May of the 22nd year, the Polish side, we've talked about it so much. For technical reasons, as they said, this exhibition was closed. Quite in the spirit of some UNESCO leaders who did not include recently. Here was a story, a list of dead journalists, representatives of the Russian media. The same logic. Maybe we should clarify what UNESCO thinks about the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum and its policy. So, on the 27th of January, representatives of Russia will not be invited to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum once again. There will be no one at the commemorative event to mention and thank the Soviet soldiers' liberators. And, in this regard, it is worth telling the organizers and all the Europeans who will be there, in your life, your work, your leisure, the existence of your peoples, your children, paid for by Soviet soldiers, their lives, their blood, who destroyed the machine of the Third Reich. You owe them a huge debt. You insult the memory of not only the fallen Red Army soldiers, whose memorials you destroy, but also the victims of the Holocaust. It's not just about Russophobia. After all, this is a continuation of anti-Semitism, collaboration. You only pretend to honor Jewish prisoners. At the same time, you are destroying memorials to Red Army soldiers, among whom there were hundreds of thousands of Jews. This is a monstrous continuation of the very segregation that, strictly speaking, gave rise to Nazism and fascism, only in such a beautiful, modern packaging. Here in the aforementioned 60th Army, which was called the Ukrainian Army, how many Jews were there? You know. You forced us to count. They didn't count themselves. But you who will pretend on January 27th that the Red Army has nothing to do with it. I will tell the aforementioned 60th Army there were 1,073 Jews. It is impossible to imagine a more blasphemous abuse of history. The spiritual heirs of the vanquished, the Neo-Bandera allies, are taking revenge on the past generation of winners. On January 27th, Russian diplomats from the General Consulate in Krakow will honor the memory of the fallen compatriots of all nationalities of the former Soviet Union, and holy wreaths will be laid at the cemetery in Auschwitz, where the soldiers who fell during the liberation of the city and its environs are buried, as well as at the monument to Soviet prisoners on the territory of the Auschwitz Museum. There were 15,200 Soviet prisoners of war. 2,000 people were left alive. It was on them in the autumn of 1941st year that the cyclone B gas was tested for the first time. It was tested not for the treatment of diseases, but as a method of execution. We remember them and will always remember them. In particular, in their memory, the Year of Defender of the Fatherland, which was announced the day before, will be celebrated every day in 2025 year. The initiative was announced by the President of the Russian Federation. This is another date, another historical event related. During the counteroffensive operation of the Soviet troops during 1940s, attempts were repeatedly made to break through the blockade ring around Leningrad, and now about the blockade, its breakthrough, the blockade of Leningrad, for any of our citizens, compatriots. The word blockade is primarily associated with Leningrad and the memory of those who survived it or could not survive it. On January 12, 1943, the troops of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts began a large-scale offensive operation under the codename Iskra on the sixth day of the offensive, January 18, 1943. The encirclement was broken. During fierce battles, Schlüsselburg and Lipki were liberated from the Nazis. As a result, a narrow corridor with a width of 11 kilometers was created on the southern coast of Lake Ladoga to supply the evacuation of the population. The complete liberation of the city became possible a year later as a result of the Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive operation. It was successfully carried out by the forces of the Leningrad, Volkhov, and the Second Baltic Fronts, in cooperation with the Baltic Fleet and long-range aviation. The 27th of January of the 44th year, in the history of the Great Patriotic War, was marked by the final lifting of the blockade and the complete liberation of Leningrad. The battle for the city became one of the hardest, one of the longest, fiercest and bloodiest battles of the Great Patriotic War. During 1944th year, during active offensive operations, Soviet troops liberated Leningrad, Novgorod, and part of the Kalinin, now Tver regions. They pushed the enemy back to the borders of Estonia, Latvia, and Finland. Then, that same Finland, which had hatched plans in alliance with Nazi Germany to seize part of Soviet territory, was forced to declare its withdrawal from the war and conclude an armistice agreement with the Soviet Union. The successful offensive in the northwestern strategic direction became the prologue to the victorious advance of our troops in the European theater of operations. An analysis of German military documents indicates that the Nazis and their accomplices planned to wipe Leningrad off the face of the earth and to subject its population to complete extermination, including by cutting off supply routes, destroying food supplies, and creating conditions for famine. The order of the Hitler command was very clear: keep the city under siege, block it hard, do not accept surrender, shoot those crossing the front line, and lead the case to the total destruction of the inhabitants. The enemy spared neither his strength nor his weapons to carry out his inhuman plans. More than 150,000 shells were fired at the city on the Neva. Over 107,000 incendiary and high-explosive bombs were dropped. Residential quarters, hospitals, maternity hospitals, schools, children's institutions, museums, palaces, institutes were subjected to barbaric bombardments and regular artillery shelling. The siege of Leningrad, unprecedented in duration and severe consequences, deliberate, with the desire to destroy people, lasted 872 days, from September 8th, 41st, to January 27th, 44th, and during this time, more than 1 million people died from hunger, disease, shelling, according to various sources. This data is being replenished thanks to historians, including volunteers. Every day, up to 4,000 residents died from exhaustion in the city on the Neva. But how they died painfully, hard, in monstrous suffering. Tens of thousands of blockade runners died during the evacuation. In the 22nd year, on the recommendation of the Prosecutor General's Office of Russia, the St. Petersburg City Court recognized the actions of the occupation authorities and the German troops, together with their accomplices, armed units formed on the territory of Belgium, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Norway, Finland, as well as individual volunteers from among Austrians, Latvians, Poles, French and Czechs. Quote, in the war crimes against humanity and genocide of national ethnic groups that represented the population of the Soviet Union, the peoples of the Soviet Union, since 1995. The memorable date of January 27, 1944, was celebrated as the day of lifting the blockade of the city of Leningrad. In the 14th year, the amended name of the Day of the Complete Liberation of Leningrad from the fascist blockade was legislatively approved, because this name fully reflects the role and contribution of the civilian population to the defense of the city. In January of the 23rd, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his speech dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the breaking of the siege of Leningrad, noted that this day is significant not only for the residents of the city, but also for the whole of Russia. Historical memory must be preserved. It is in order that such tragedies that our people experienced during the Great Patriotic War should never be repeated. There is also a practical sense, so that we can respond in time to the threats that arise against our country, the Russian president said. It is still the most important date in our bilateral relations. On January 30th, the Russian Federation and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam celebrate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations. Let me remind you that the Soviet Union was among the first to recognize the new sovereign state of Southeast Asia in 1950th year, thereby providing significant assistance to the heroic Vietnamese people in their long struggle for freedom and independence, as well as during the period of peaceful existence. It is symbolic that in April of this year Vietnam celebrates the 50th anniversary of the liberation of the south of the country and its unification. It took place on the 30th of April, 75th year, and in September we will celebrate and congratulate our Vietnamese friends on the 80th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which was realized and proclaimed on September 2nd, 1945th year. In turn, the expected participation of the Vietnamese leadership in the festive events in Moscow on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Great Patriotic War. There is an intensive and trusting political dialogue between our countries. Of particular note is the state visit of the President of Russia to Vietnam in June of the 24th year. In September last year, the Chairman of the National Assembly, IDS the Members of Parliament, paid an official visit to the Russian Federation. In October of the 24th year, the head of the Russian state met with the Prime Minister of the government of Vietnam on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan. In mid-January of this year, the chairman of the government of the Russian Federation, Mikhail Vladimirovich Mishustin, visited Hanoi. During the meetings with partners, important agreements were reached on enhancing cooperation in various fields. And in recent years, the indicators of mutual trade have shown steady growth. Joint oil and gas projects are being implemented on the continental shelf of Vietnam. In the Nenets Autonomous Okrug of the Russian Federation, the production of Russian vehicles in Vietnam continues. Cooperation in the field of peaceful atom. Scientific and educational humanitarian ties are developing. Cooperation in the field of tourism. Our countries hold similar or overlapping positions on global and regional issues. Closely coordinates their activities at the UN and other international organizations. Close and active cooperation in all these and many other areas made it possible to raise the level of Russian-Vietnamese relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership back in the 12th year. Of course, we are aimed at promoting it in the interests of the peoples of our countries and ensuring peace and security in the region. And of course, taking this opportunity, I want to congratulate all citizens of Vietnam on the upcoming New Year. According to the traditional calendar, the joyful Tet holiday is the 29th of January. I want to wish everyone well-being, prosperity, and all the best. And I am ready to answer your questions. Is international life with us?
Yes, hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Here is how you could comment on the role of the Vatican in solving humanitarian problems and in resolving, of course, the Ukrainian crisis against the background of the destructive position of the West.
You know, of course, against the background of the destructive line of the collective West on. As they say, inflicting a strategic defeat on us of the very collective West, which in fact unleashed a hybrid war against Russia and provoked the conflict in Ukraine. It is against this background that the balanced and verified position of the Vatican, the personal position of Pope Francis, who seeks to contribute to the settlement of this acute problem and acute crisis, stands out favorably. And, by the way, about statements and words, after all, we have never heard any calls to end or not to start negotiations from the Vatican and its diplomatic service representatives. We have never heard them say that the outcome of events should be decided only on the battlefield, and so on. We have heard completely different rhetoric. I would especially like to note the positive role of the Holy See in resolving a number of humanitarian problems in the context of the aforementioned conflict. Here, we have established not only constructive, but also effective cooperation with the Vatican, bringing concrete results. With the active personal participation of the Pope's special envoy for a peaceful settlement in Ukraine, Cardinal Materjupa, 16 wounded servicemen of the armed forces of our country returned to Russia as part of 2 recent Russian-Ukrainian prisoner exchanges. It was the 30th of December of the 24th year, the 15th of January of this year. This work was carried out in the development of the Moscow agreements. They were achieved during the Cardinal's next visit to Russia in October of the 24th year. The message about this was published by us, and we look forward to continuing our cooperation with the Vatican on humanitarian issues in the same constructive and effective way. As a matter of fact, we offer the same we expect from all foreign partners who strive to achieve long-term peace based on respect for the legitimate interests of all people and peoples living in this region. But not everyone demonstrates such an aspiration, such a desire in response. Here the Vatican demonstrates.
Thank you very much.
So, is the news with us? Hello, yes. We will have 2 questions. How the Russian side assesses Trump's statement on Ukraine. In an interview with journalists, he noted that Russia will face big problems if it does not make a deal. Is it worth reminding the American leader that Moscow constantly talks about openness to negotiations? You know, we are hearing now. I would just like to build an answer to your question from several blocks, because there were also several theses in your question. The first one, well, now it's literally not that loud statements are being made every day, every hour. Before that, it was President-elect Trump. Now it's just President Trump. Well, this is a tactic. It is known. Second, as for Ukraine, both advisors to Trump's presidential candidates and advisors to President-elect Trump, who took office, and us President Donald Trump himself, have repeatedly said that the previous American administration, the Biden administration, Biden personally, and American foreign policy made mistakes in Ukraine. Moreover, they characterized these mistakes, called them severe, the heaviest. You can specify the epithets yourself. These statements were all made publicly. They are available. I would just like to point out that in addition to these statements, although we qualify in many areas what the Biden administration did, not only as mistakes, but also as crimes. But it should be noted that even if we are talking about the mistakes of the past Biden administration, these same mistakes were not made by them in a personal capacity. They made these mistakes in a national capacity. As the head of state, Biden committed them. His administration as the current administration, American officials committed them, representing the United States of America. And what they do with the mistakes that were made on behalf of the country, or in the course of governing the country, they correct them. Therefore, I think we need to leave. The current administration of President Trump has repeatedly stated, acknowledged, and argued in favor of the fact that the situation in Ukraine. This is the result of the mistakes of the previous administration, but it is probably necessary to correct these mistakes of the previous administration. I say again, this is not some kind of our own thesis. This is the logic of the statements that were made from the United States itself, but it is unlikely that repeating what Biden and his regime did will be correcting mistakes. Thank you. And one more question. French President Emmanuel Macron plans to mobilize young volunteers to strengthen the country's army in case of danger. How can you assess such intentions, and what goals does the French leader really pursue? Well, this is not a new story. We see how for a number of years Paris has been taking measures, trying to strengthen its own army and technical potential. Here in the 22nd year, the same Macron announced his intention to prepare the armed forces, direct quote, for a high-intensity war and put the economy on a military track. That was his phrase. A new law was adopted then in military planning. It provides for a twofold increase in the country's military budget. I mean France. And the development of new types of weapons has also been going on for 10 years. Many of them are tested, by the way, in Ukraine, on Ukrainians by the French. Because Ukraine has become, through the efforts of the collective West, both an instrument of hybrid warfare and a real testing ground. By the way, let's recall Zelensky's statement again, and a representative of his regime, Ukrainian high-ranking military personnel, who spoke and called on the West to test new types of weapons in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian army, which is what happens. And France is no exception. It is also planned to increase the number of the main reserve personnel of the French armed forces. Accordingly, the plans announced by the French president to attract young people to military service fully fit into this militaristic course. Now the second part of your question, what is the goal? It seems to me that the answer is obvious, and we need to look for it in the statements of the French leader himself. In a recent address to the French armed forces, he said, "The French security line runs through the French borders in Europe and Ukraine." Let's not, said Macron, deceive ourselves. The Ukrainian conflict will not end either tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, end quote. It is clear that, in my opinion, and it is obvious, if we consider this phrase, that Paris is preparing for a continuation of confrontation. Well, another evidence in favor of this, although it is not good for harm, but there is a stable expression, yes. This means that there were no other statements about negotiations, about some kind of peace initiative, a peace plan, on the part of the Elysee Palace. Therefore, obviously, they chose the path of confrontation. Confrontations are also clear with whom, with our country. And for this, apparently they need to prepare their own youth. So far in France, this is being discussed as a measure that will be taken on a voluntary basis. But after all, in Ukraine in the beginning, too, everything was kind of voluntary, and then the Ludolevs with glasses appeared. I think that in addition to the fact that Macron declares this in his national capacity, he also relays, as they say, the narratives of the war party, probably, which combines representatives of different countries of the North Atlantic and characterizes the lack of desire and aspiration, and in general understanding that it is necessary to respect the laws. The interests of Russia in it characterizes the desire to prolong the Ukrainian crisis and use Ukrainians as a tool of struggle or deterrence or inflicting a strategic defeat on us, as they formulate it. Another proof of this is that France, Paris, and Macron personally have been one all these years. They were one of the main patrons, or even better say, instigators of the Kyiv regime. And moreover, they consistently even raised the degree of their rhetoric and escalation in general. We regularly hear arguments from French officials, and absolutely irresponsible ones, about the possible sending of NATO contingents to Ukraine. Then they say that they will be instructors. Then they say that they will be those who will provide military assistance to the armed forces. Then, it seems that some European peacekeepers are clearly trying to send a signal to Zelensky with new militant statements, from which he demands lowering the mobilization age up to 18 years, about what we talked today. And again, it seems that Macron is doing this in order to block a statement of such, well, at least of such a peaceful nature, which a number of European politicians and American politicians allow themselves. Here is the impression that it is necessary to drown it out, to block it somehow with these next aggressive words. And, by the way, the other day, there were reports in the media about the training of the French special forces, which took place on the terrain with a topography similar to the radiation of the Dnieper to the north of Kyiv. Well, in general, for our part, we would advise adjusting the location for such future maneuvers and choosing, well, for example, a water barrier similar to the Berezina River. And why not? To properly practice the skills of retreat. This is a river and its landscape that can be reconstructed. It's quite suitable. Thank you very much. So, with us, Lee. Thank you, Media Corporation of China. Yes, hello. 2 questions. We have already had a lot said about Donald Trump today. After taking office as President of the United States, he signed a number of decrees to implement his election promises. I would like to clarify how Russia assesses his return to power. What are Moscow's expectations from Trump for the development of Russian-American relations in the future? I, in this case, Sasha, will quote again. Excuse me. Quoting once the statements of the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. He spoke about this in detail on January 20th during a meeting with permanent members of the Russian Security Council. He noted that we see the statement of the newly elected President of the United States, members of his team, about the desire to restore direct contacts with our country, interrupted not through our fault of the outgoing administration. We hear a statement about the need to do everything to prevent a third world war. We welcome this attitude. We have never refused dialogue, the Russian president stressed. We have always been ready to maintain even relations of cooperation with any American administration, and proceed from the assumption, the head of the Russian state stressed, that the dialogue will be built on an equal and mutually beneficial basis, taking into account the significant role played by our countries on a number of key issues on the agenda in the world, including strengthening strategic stability and security. End quote. But we are completely. You can find this on the Kremlin's website. Thanks. One more question. The agenda of the meeting of the Committee of Permanent Representatives of the EU countries for the 24th of January includes an item on the approval by the EU Council of a resolution on the extension of economic sanctions expiring in January against Russia. At the same time, last December, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban told the leaders of the EU countries that he was ready to resort to a veto on the extension of sanctions, as a result of which their term would expire on January 31st. He explained that if Trump goes to ease sanctions, he will also insist on a similar step from the EU, and the Financial Times published information that entry measures are being worked out that will make it possible to ignore, perhaps, Hungary's veto. How do you assess this policy of the European Union? Well, I think it can only be assessed as the next twists and turns of the bureaucratic process within the EU, around the approval or extension of restrictive anti-Russian measures. if they allow themselves to not comply with the norms of international law and just at will, selectively, and sometimes just turn this international law inside out, what can we say about their own legislation? Well, it seems to me that they have already created everything possible with their laws. They just abused him. Because the unilateral sanctions themselves are an absolutely illegitimate measure from the point of view of international law. I think everyone has already learned that the anti-Russian sanctions regularly extended and expanded by the European Union are the result of the so-called joint creativity of the EU liberal elites who build their political careers on the myth of the Russian threat, and those who stand behind them, and these are American political and financial and economic circles. That's it. And then, this is, so to speak, the result of this conglomeration is simply imposed on everyone. It seems to me that it has already become obvious to many, to those who did not want to believe it and did not want to understand it, that sanctions against our country do not work in the format in which they were conceived. They primarily hit the member countries themselves and their economies. The restrictions promoted by Brussels aimed, simply as an example, to cut off domestic business from world markets and the financial system, deprive access to advanced technologies, and provoke economic destabilization in the country. In this format, in this volume, on this scale, in this frenzy, I would say, they did not succeed. Russia is developing its economy. It develops, and does it in new geopolitical and geoeconomic realities. Yes, indeed, we were ready to develop relations with them on an equal basis, for the prosperity of ourselves, their countries, and, in principle, humanity. But if they went this way, it's strange that they thought that we would not be able to mobilize in this sense. And it's strange, by the way, that they thought we wouldn't be able to answer them. It's strange that they thought we wouldn't be able to find a way out. We are building these very equal, mutually beneficial and respectful partnership relations with the countries of the world majority. This is the reality. European statistics regularly record the decline of industry in the countries of the European Union. It's just that there are numbers. For the 24th year, the industrial production index in the EU fell by, well, almost 2%. Let's be precise, 1.7% compared to a year earlier. The reduction of industry is also recorded there. I can say that in most of these countries, 17 of the 27 EU member states, Germany, and this was once the locomotive of the EU economy. In the second half of last year, a monthly decline of an average of 4% was recorded. Well, the question is no longer about us. Should they take an illegitimate path to harm Russia? The question is already about them, and they should take an illegitimate path in order to worsen their own economic situation. In my opinion, our position has always been very clear on this issue, when and if the European Union stops this rampage. We will be determined, we will see, and so on. While they are engaged in this destructive action, we will defend ourselves. And if they act pointwise against us, we will respond to them in the same way, based on our interests. I want to emphasize once again, and I do this, including not without a certain tactic, I constantly remind them of this, so that later they do not say that we did not tell them this. It wasn't our choice. This is what the collective West has chosen for themselves, for the world as a whole. So, if you have everything, let's move on. Thank you. Lee Kyoto Tsushin is with us.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is about the Japanese center in your country, in the Russian Federation. The day before yesterday, your press release reported that the Russian Foreign Ministry led to the Japanese side to terminate the application of the memorandum on the Japanese center between Russia and Japan, signed in 2000 and 2000 and the third year. And I have carefully read your press release, and I almost understand your position, but I don't really understand what your decision means. So now there are 6 Japanese centers in your country, not only in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, and Nizhny Novgorod. And there before that, many Russians continued to study not only Japanese, but also Japanese territory and others. And I am sure that yes, these Japanese centers are purely symbols of friendship between our countries, regardless of our diplomatic relations. And your decision has already been made. And tell me, please, is it after your decision that these 6 Japanese centers cannot exist in your country? Or do they need to be closed? Or do they need to be discontinued? And if it is necessary to terminate actions, and from what date it is necessary to terminate actions? And to be honest, yes, not only the Japanese are interested in this topic. Many of my Russian friends are waiting for your answer. I ask you to explain the situation.
Absolutely. I knew that there were questions from Japanese journalists about this, and I prepared for this issue. I'm just, surprised at how you separated the two things. You say that everything is fine and well, as if we have to maintain the friendship that exists between our countries, regardless of how diplomatic relations develop there. Wait, and diplomatic relations? Are they developing between whom and whom? Diplomatic relations are relations between countries. It's not just a few people talking to a few people. Diplomatic relations. I do not know, however, how it is in Japan. But in general, we have been taught this from diplomatic practice, from diplomatic experience, and from our work. It follows that diplomatic relations are relations between states, between countries, between peoples, and so on. How did you manage to separate these two topics in such a way? In other words, it doesn't matter what happens there at the official level, let's just develop friendship. We are only for developing friendship. Only this friendship should include the totality of the life of countries. And it's not that some are friends, and the second are friends with each other, not even with each other, and in this case I'm talking about Tokyo. They come up with some new destructive ways to destroy this friendship. We talk about this very often. You don't come to us so often. If you came more often, I would. You would have heard, but you can also read. And a statement, the statement and measures that Tokyo is taking against our country and sanctions. Is this a manifestation of friendship? Now directly about the decision made. Indeed, we have it described in detail in the message of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of January 21st. We are talking about the termination of the application of 2 intergovernmental memoranda of the 2000th and 2003 year memorandum between the government of our country and the government of Japan on the establishment and operation of Japanese centers for technical assistance and reforms carried out in the Russian Federation on the territory of the Russian Federation. It was signed in Tokyo on the 5th of September of the 2000th year, and a memorandum between the government of the Russian Federation and the government of Japan on the activities of the Japanese Center for Technical Assistance and reforms carried out in the Russian Federation on the territory of our country. It was signed in Vladivostok on June 29, 2003. At one time, these agreements were reached on the understanding that cooperation with Japan in implementing reforms in Russia will contribute, as in fact it is recorded in the documents, to the establishment of a creative partnership between the two countries, as well as the comprehensive development of ties in various fields, including economic and cultural. Do we have the right to talk about Tokyo's desire to deepen mutual understanding and strengthen friendly interstate relations today? No, we can't talk about it. I simply have no right to speak, because it does not correspond to the factors. Facts. Can we talk about a creative partnership? No. Tokyo's actions are killing this creative partnership. They are destructive not only for friendship, not only for partnership, in general for any normal contact between countries. The openly hostile steps taken by the Japanese government against our country since February 2022 year, including illegitimate sanctions against the Russian leadership and illegitimate sanctions against citizens of our country, and illegal sanctions against financial institutions, entire sectors of the economy, depriving Russia of the most favored nation status in trade, participation, regardless of the form, in the plundering of sovereign assets, holdings, support for the Russophobic line of Kyiv, the Kyiv regime, including through the provision of material and technical assistance to the Kyiv regime. This completely negates everything, going against the spirit and letter of the memoranda, what is defined in these memoranda. And it is absolutely clear that in the conditions of the continuation of the anti-Russian policy of the Sybiha administration, including the adoption of the next package of restrictions on January 10th of this year, the goals and objectives declared in the above-mentioned documents, they, alas, have lost their relevance, but not by themselves. They were simply killed by the concrete steps of Japanese officials. And this very interaction, which is spelled out in the memoranda based on the relevant parameters, has simply exhausted itself, but again, not by itself, but because of the actions of official Tokyo. In concrete terms, we proceed from the fact that the application of memoranda ceases from the date of notification of the Japanese side of the decision of the government of the Russian Federation of the corresponding note. It all happened on the 21st of January. Accordingly, from the 21st of January, the effect of this decision begins. As for the future of the Japanese centers themselves, which are Russian legal entities fully funded by the Japanese government and operating under the control of the Japanese government, their activities, accordingly, are now outside the framework of bilateral intergovernmental agreements, and the further legal conditions for their functioning, their status, primarily funding from abroad, obviously need to be qualified by our Russian relevant departments. In addition, the Japanese side also has the right to decide on the closure of the centers, in compliance with the requirements of Russian legislation. That's it. If you have any additional questions, or someone will send you any questions, please send us, and we will answer these questions specifically for you.
Can I have a little extra?
Of course.
I didn't really understand a little. So it's not necessary to directly close the Japanese center or directly terminate the actions, is it?
It is not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that makes these decisions. These decisions are made by our respective authorized bodies, which look at the legal status and then make appropriate decisions. If you are interested in this legal aspect, I will clarify the colleagues who are dealing with this issue, and if there is any invoice, we will definitely share it with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lee Reuter is with us.
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon.
Yes, hello.
We are with you. We have a question again about Trump. Here he literally constantly says that Russian President Vladimir Putin must agree to an end to the Ukrainian conflict. But could you tell us what Russia's red lines are in possible future discussions about ending the conflict? And in general, how to make it so that a possible agreement is not just an agreement on a temporary ceasefire, but becomes the basis for lasting peace in a conflict that has been going on for more than 1 year, if not 1 decade.
You know, it seems to me that this expression of the red line is so often and sometimes inappropriately used that it seems that we are discussing some kind of picture. Well, I don't know. There's a red horse bathing, and you're asking me. That's where the red lines are. Show me. Right now we are going to repeat what we are saying. The Russian side says repeatedly, but it's not difficult for me. The Russian approaches were formulated in principle like this in aggregate, so that everything, as it were, could be combined and viewed from different sides, in all aspects, and in integrity. They were formulated by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, in 2024 year, and presented in this very hall of the press center of the Russian Foreign Ministry. They are accessible, they are open. It is possible and necessary to work for those who are not fixated on aggression and on their own painful ambitions, but who are looking for ways out of the situation. This is what the Russian approaches are. Therefore, it seems to me, from this very primitiveness, which, well, probably in some matters, and primitiveness is not bad, but not in this for sure. The difficult situation around Ukraine is unconditional. Well, just a country and a state that is collapsing, destroyed from the point of view of the political state structure, destroyed from the inside by endless experiments from the West, sacrificing its citizens daily, simply driving them to slaughter, demanding from the world support for this very terrorist activity more and more and more. You see, and bent, I mean the Kiev regime and itself, and being driven by the collective West literally into a dead end. Here, you know, here's what it would be worth thinking about. Russian approaches are formulated. Russia does not contradict itself in these approaches, clearly saying that they responded to the negotiations, were ready, and demonstrated an appropriate position during this very negotiation process. We have repeatedly said that for those who see a peaceful political and diplomatic settlement, there is a way to put pressure on those who ban Zelensky from negotiating. For those who are looking for this answer to questions in a peaceful political and diplomatic format, they talked about the need to unblock Ukraine of this self-imposed law, naturally under pressure from the West, about the impossibility of negotiating, and so on, and so on. In other words, we do not have contradictions in our position, so that now we once again return to the question of the line, hell, I don't know, something else. We are systematically approaching this issue, openly approaching this issue. We have declared everything, presented everything, regularly comment on the situation around the conflict, and our assessments call things by their proper names. So why do we have to go back again to some strangely simplified characteristics of this situation?
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Is the news portal with us? Ru.
Maria Vladimirovna. Hello.
Hello.
News portal. Ru, Pavel Vorobyov. Yes, we are with you. We have one question for you today regarding Armenia. Speaker of the Armenian Parliament, Alan Simonyan, said that Yerevan has no plans to withdraw from the EU. Although the government of the Republic at the same time approved a bill on joining the European Union, at the same time, we all know that Moscow has repeated several times before that it is impossible to stay into associations at the same time. And recently there were talks between the foreign ministers of our countries, respectively Sergei Lavrov and Rarik Azayan. I wonder if the Armenian side has commented on these negotiations in any way and explained its desire to sit on two chairs at the same time. And what about this? What opinion does the Russian Foreign Ministry have?
You know, if we talk about the talks between the heads of the Russian and Armenian foreign ministries, who were recently in Moscow, the relevant comments were given at a press conference, including on these issues. And, accordingly, the message on the results was also published. If that's not enough, I say again, everything is contained there. I can say again, maybe in addition. The conversation was frank, but not everything was on camera. A lot of things happened with closed doors. It was 3 hours with the doors closed. Therefore, I can say from this that there really was a frank conversation on many points that are of particular relevance to the parties.
And if you can clarify, out of these 3 hours, well, let's just say, is there any hope for a positive solution to the issue?
Never lose it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is Moscow Baku with us? Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. I have 2 questions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, but it's no secret that I'm also talking about Trump. It is no secret that the United States, under the Joe Biden administration, has in recent years emphasized its negative policy in the South Caucasus. Ilham Aliyev has repeatedly said this. Some states in the region tried to set up against Russia and interfered in internal affairs. In your opinion, with the coming to power of Donald Trump in the United States, there is a possibility that this focus of negative attention of us policy in Transcaucasia will decrease. And with such a plot, it will increase the chance of signing a peace treaty between Baku and Yerevan, as well as launching a more full-fledged, full-format work of the 3+3 mechanism. You know, to be honest, it is difficult to predict now what kind of policy the new Trump administration will build in relation to the South Caucasus. The experience of past years shows that attempts to interfere outside the regionals, and they primarily include the United States of America, the European Union, in the affairs of the region, did not lead to anything good. We have repeatedly repeated that the real roadmap of reconciliation and stable peace of Baku-Yerevan is reflected in the complex of trilateral statements of the leaders of Russia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, which were concluded from the 20th to the 22nd years. We support a direct dialogue between Baku and Yerevan, and we are always ready to provide the Azerbaijani and Armenian partners with the required assistance on all tracks of normalization, elaboration of a balanced peace treaty, unblocking of transport and economic ties, delimitation, demarcation of the border, development of contacts through civil society. In order to achieve sustainable peace and well-being, it is important to consolidate the process in a regional paradigm. As for the 3+3 platform for regional cooperation, this is a promising mechanism, a mechanism for building direct cooperation between the countries of the South Caucasus, the immediate neighbors of the dialogue, and this format, mentioned in the format, has nothing to do with the West. He has his own tasks, his own goals. It has a progressive development, interaction, as stated goals, in the direction of mutual interest. And in general, no one is hiding. There is no such, hidden calendar agenda. Everything is stated, everything, so to speak, demonstrates exactly similar goals within this format. Well, I mean demonstrate, declare, confirm. The last, third meeting in Istanbul was held on the 18th of October last year. The foreign ministers of the participating countries agreed on a plan of further actions, which will be confidently implemented in the current 25th year.
Yeah.
Well, as you told my colleague, there are still some chances, hopes for a bright future. Under Trump, under Trump. Well, do you pin your hopes only on the American electoral cycle? Close that will somehow become easier and better. In order to make it easier and better in global terms, we need to work on the realization of our own interests ourselves. In this case, since we are talking about states, national interests, and of course, it would be nice for everyone to respect international law and each other. This is the basis of hopes that are not empty, but those that are being realized. That's a straight secret I've revealed to you now. Therefore, I think I answered your colleague's question a little more fully. Yes, and we had a second question. Yes, in the fourth year, Russia strengthened relations with the countries of the global south. In fact, now it continues to do this, including within the framework of the BRICS presidency. Please explain what the situation was at the time of the Russian presidency. What are the prospects for BRICS membership with Azerbaijan? And in addition, to what extent have you remembered the position of Moscow and Baku on the issue of building a more just world order today? You know, it seems to me, of course, first of all, this is a question that should be addressed to Baku, because we are talking about the presence of a sovereign state in the Union. For our part, we can only welcome the desire of Azerbaijan, as well as other countries close to us, to join cooperation within the framework of the BRICS Association, which defends the interests of the world majority, which we are doing. It's just that last year, we commented on it very actively, and for one simple reason. We were chairman. Now the chairmanship has passed to another country. But, in general, our position has not changed from this. But at the same time, I want to refer to the fact that this is exactly what is recorded in the joint statement of the leaders of Russia and Azerbaijan. On August 19th of the 24th year, we consistently advocate the expansion of BRICS cooperation with the states of the global south and east, first of all, with those who share the focus on strengthening multilateral principles in international relations, pursue a sovereign foreign policy course, and do not join illegitimate third-party sanctions that are introduced or developed by passing the decisions of the UN Security Council. In the 24th year, within the framework of the Russian presidency of the BRICS, like-minded people, including Azerbaijan, tried to involve the state to the maximum in the events of the association in the traditional format of outreach BRICS, and they intend to continue these efforts ahead with the Brazilian watch of the association in the current 25th year. As for the prospects of gaining full membership of the BRICS, such a decision, like any association, is made on the basis of comprehensive consultations. Consensus. Last year, Azerbaijan was included in the expanded list of countries that expressed interest in strengthening cooperation with the association. The BRICS doors are open. Well, I want to say again that I don't think I'm saying anything new here. I'm just repeating what was said before our presidency and recorded in the relevant documents. And the priority at the same time is to increase the efficiency and consolidate the expanded BRICS strategic partnership. Simply, based on your question, I reminded you of everything that was already said there literally a month and a half or 2 months ago, and throughout the 24th year by the Russian side. But Moscow's position in Baku is similar, yes, on the issue of building a just world order. In the question of which one? A just world order. But it seems to me that we have repeatedly talked about this and emphasized it on many key issues. If I say so, probably our positions are similar, or even coincide on most of these issues. Well, it's just that your question is very general, so a fairly general answer. Thank you very much. To you, thank you. With us La Arti, the TV channel Rush Today. Yes, good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. We are interested in how Russia feels about the fact that Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić accuses the West of trying to carry out a color revolution in Serbia. Thank you. You know, I would like to say that such facts have been recorded historically because both the Balkans and Serbia itself in any configuration, whether Serbia has Yugoslavia, caused increased irritation among the collective West in connection with its cultural historical identity, in connection with its historical position, in connection with the presence of its own a peaceful vision of the development of the situation in the Balkans, and in Europe as a whole, and in the world too. You know, sometimes I get some kind of feeling based on the facts again. This is not only some kind of emotional assessment, but it is based on historical facts. It's as if this collective West, which incited fascists and Nazis, and then did not counteract them to the proper extent, and then also helped them to escape after the defeat of the Nazi troops by the Soviet Union. It seems that they all cannot forgive Serbia for its principled position because, being in the center of Europe, which was at that time gripped first by this obsequiousness to Nazism and fascination with Nazism, then non-resistance to Nazism, then collaboration with Nazism and fascism. Being in the center, even in the epicenter of all this, Serbia, took a principled position, and it seems that this could not be forgiven. You see, Serbia has not become, and the Serbian people have not become a stronghold of this very racial hatred, dehumanization. And as if that's what they can't forgive. They cannot forgive the fact that in the 90s, the Serbs defended fundamentally important things for them, that they did not abandon their culture, their history, that they did not abandon their faith. And historically, as I have already said, Serbia attracted many from the West who wanted to restore their own order there. So also during the 20th century, it was as if Serbia was not forgiven for standing up and defending fateful things for itself. But hence, accordingly, the continuation of what is happening now, and now it's some kind of monstrous desire, and desire of the West to lure Serbia into its arms, which are definitely unfriendly. Friends don't do that. Friends don't betray like that. Friends don't cheat like that. And to lure into the embrace, exactly in order to betray and deceive, and take advantage of, as they, in fact, do with many others, when they realize that it's not so easy with Serbia. And look at how close Westerners have repeatedly been from their point of view to pushing Serbia to self-deception, or to false trust in the West. And every time they failed. We have already acted in different ways, and the forces acted in the 90s of the Westerners against Serbia, and by meanness tearing away from it its historical peace, territory, and so many cultural objects, the most important from the spiritual point of view of Kosovo, and by trickery, and by sucking up through some promises and so on. And every time Serbia remains true to itself. And of course, now these attempts, they do not abandon. As for the specific parameters, you probably need to ask the President of Serbia. Figures, facts, data. This is a question for him. I mean, not to me. I cannot comment on these factors and facts. Only the head of Serbia has them. But the historical logic of Western actions against Serbia was presented to you today as an answer to the question. And we, of course, always stand in solidarity with friendly Serbia in resisting this most harmful external influence, in defending independence in internal and external affairs. I think no one questions this. But, of course, we also see in principle a form identical to the influence of the West on sovereign states. Look at it as if their impact on the state is being built up under a carbon copy. These are attempts by the United States and its allies to reshape and distort the will of voters after each election, giving their own assessments as it were. But such, are no longer even intrusive, but imposed by force. We see by what means, and according to whose instructions, there are many puppet angos working there, various kinds of so-called civil activists, who promote Western ones. Not Western in the context of Serbia's integration into the Western economic space, and Western schemes that are beneficial to the West. We see how people are provoked who go out, let's say, to rallies in their own country, in Serbia, to defend their civil rights, and how immediately, adding fuel to the fire, they are provoked to turn these actions from democratic manifestations into anti-state. These are, different things. Therefore, we see all this. We see how people are trying to work for Western interests with their hands. And we see how again there are attempts to plant this chaos, as it happens in Serbia and in other countries, because it is, literally some kind of universal key of the collective West to enter this or that state, which cannot fight back, or they believe in these very Western assurances. Therefore, the task is set, again, using chaos and these methods listed above, to deprive Belgrade of its sovereign will, to force it to sacrifice vital interests, to abandon normal, friendly historical relations with Russia, betray Russia. But these are not just high words, although they are certainly important now for any country and people. Words about friendship are worth a lot because there are concrete actions behind them, but it still hits the Serbs themselves. The refusal that the West insists on firm relations with Russia, the demand for this refusal, did not begin in the 22nd year. It's been happening all the time. In the 22nd year, the pressure of the West simply intensified. They simply have special friendly relations between our countries, between our peoples, across their throats. So, if you have everything, let's move on. Liverick is with us. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. I have two questions. The first one was partially answered, but still it did not become clear. Have you found Armenia-Russia have come to a common denominator on the issue of the draft law on Armenia's membership in the European Union? Or does Russia's position remain the same, as Deputy Prime Minister Alexei voiced, that Moscow regards this bill as the beginning of Armenia's withdrawal from the Eurasian Economic Union? Why am I asking? Because at the same meeting, Ararat Mirzoyan said that the Armenian parliament will adopt this bill. And today Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said the same, and that the Armenian parliament will adopt this bill.
Well, you see, you formulated the question like this, from the category, have you eaten or are you delicious? That's like some two. For some reason, there are two parts of the question that are somehow combined into one thesis opposed. So, let's do it again. Yes, first of all, I have already answered. Secondly, We discussed everything, including complex issues, exchanged opinions, expressed our positions. But as for whether the position that was voiced by the Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian government, Mr. Averchuk, is relevant or not, well, probably, it would be possible to raise the question in this way if it was a politicized position, or if it was an exclusively politically formulated stated position. The position stated by the Deputy Prime Minister of the government of the Russian Federation, Mr. Verchik, is based on the laws of science, economics, and jurisprudence. That's what it's based on. And the explanations given by Mr. Overchik, they are not political declarations. They were and are an explanation of the obvious consequences, which obviously follow from certain steps. That's it. He explained the patterns and did not make political or politically biased or political of any kind. Political and detached from reality statements. Of course not. Therefore, this is not something that, is, as it were, divorced from the substance of the issue. This was just an explanation of the essence of the issue. I am referring to Mr. Verchik's statement. Therefore, to talk about whether you talked or Mr. Verchik's actual statement, I think it's somehow impossible to even raise a question like that.
My question was about something else. Was it possible to come to a common understanding during the negotiations, or did each side remain on its own? Because I see that the Armenian government has stated at the highest level that this process will continue already in parliament. We knew Russia's position. We have to understand whether each side has remained on its own, or managed to find some kind of compromise solution during these 3-hour negotiations that you mentioned.
Well, I have already commented, as the foreign minister was commented at the press conference. You do it somehow. How to say it? Don't you want to hear or understand here? I will repeat once again. I hope, today there will be a final explanation of this. Our negotiations involve an exchange of views on the issue. This exchange of views took place. Our position, which was voiced by the social persons of the Russian Federation mentioned by you, is not based on politicized demands or political ones. It is not political declarations. It is based on realities, on laws, on the economy, on an understanding of legality and law. That's exactly what it's based on. You are asking me again about compromises and so on. There are certain laws of the genre, which were explained by Mr. Averchik, in my opinion, in an extremely correct form. And the negotiations allowed the parties to exchange views on these issues. Of course, there are probably different political figures from all sides who will have their own views, but at the same time, I think that this meeting, these negotiations have certainly allowed a very frank and trusting dialogue to take place.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The second question. I would like to know your opinion about the current leader in Baku. With the grossest violations of human rights in the trial of the leadership of the father. I remember that in the 2023 year, Russian President Vladimir Putin, when asked to comment on the Valde Club, that's detention and everything else, he expressed hope that the Azerbaijani leadership will show humanitarian character towards the detained leaders of Nagorno-Karabakh. But as it became known from Ruben Vartanyan's letter, all the protocols of the interrogation with him were falsified. His ability to defend himself, his rights to defend himself, are grossly violated. He had previously stated that torture had been used against him. We can say that there was a similar approach with respect to all other detained Armenians who are currently being tried. In this regard, I would like to know your opinion about what is happening now.
If we talk in general about the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, which, unfortunately, could not stop for many years, despite various attempts. If we talk about this process in general, it has led to a huge number of problems, including colossal humanitarian problems between Baku and Yerevan, and so, within the framework of the trilateral process, the leaders of Russia, Azerbaijan and Armenia reached agreements, including on the need to resolve humanitarian issues. Statement of the 31st of October, 2022 year. It is said that the direct quote of the parties agreed to make additional efforts aimed at urgently solving the remaining tasks, including resolving humanitarian issues. Of course, quotes, "We confirm our commitment to these agreements. We are ready to provide the necessary assistance to Azerbaijani and Armenian partners in terms of respecting the rights of refugees, preserving cultural, historical, religious heritage, searching for missing persons during military operations, exchanges, and the return of all detained persons. I am sure that this will contribute to creating an atmosphere of trust and dialogue between Baku and Yerevan. Yes, I understand that you, as always, and as you want before, know the answer in the format. Click on the button. You will get the result. But there are issues that have been complicated for decades. For decades they have not been resolved, but they have only become more complicated. And these questions from the same number, they did not arise in a second. They are part of a tangle of problems that has been forming for several decades. Therefore, it should be solved according to the recipe I mentioned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is this a Moscow Post with us? Hello, we have two questions today. First, Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President held talks the day after Donald Trump's inauguration. The relations between the two countries are called a comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction, entering a new era. Moscow and Beijing stand in solidarity on international platforms. Their positions on the vast majority of foreign policy issues are close or coincide. Could you help me briefly formulate where the positions of Russia and China coincide with respect to the United States, in addition to the rejection of the policy of unilateral American dominance in world affairs? Our countries, I mean Russia and China, really value the relations of partnership and strategic cooperation, including those formed in this way, thanks to the personal efforts of the leaders of the two countries. Thanks to their contribution, these relations have reached an unprecedented level. Our cooperation is based on a broad community of national interests. It does not depend on domestic political factors, current conjunctures in third countries. Our connections are self-sufficient. We understand each other's tasks and interests. Our ties and our relations have, one might say, such a powerful internal energy. They are developing on the basis of the principles of equality, mutual respect, and support on issues that are vital for our countries. Russia and China are also closely coordinated in international affairs. The foreign policy bond between Moscow and Beijing makes an important contribution to building a just world order, resolving issues of a global and regional nature. We have demonstrated more than once a responsible approach to world affairs together. This is determined by the coincidence and closeness of views on key world problems. At the same time, we do not seek confrontation with anyone and are not friends against anyone. Now about the United States of America, because it's always like. I understand that there is a concept of triangles, relations, poles, and so on in diplomacy, in the history of international relations, in geopolitics, but the most important way to characterize, the most important attention should be paid to the quality of bilateral relations between Russia and China. Now about the United States of America and this factor that you mentioned. We see a coincidence of the position of Russia and China in relation to the United States. Yes, in general, and in relation to other countries too. We are talking about the fact that we have never set ourselves the task of slamming the door, shutting down contacts, and even more so there, to take out a club, and start waving it with sanctions or some other kind. This also applies to the United States of America, taking into account the importance of the three mentioned states for the world, and in general, because otherwise, I don't mean refusing to slam doors, but just slamming doors is absolutely counterproductive. We strive for positivity and for guidance and for efficiency, and in this case, in this sense, we coincide with our Chinese partners, their goals and objectives. We have never initiated the introduction of unilateral or illegitimate measures of influence. Moscow and Beijing have repeatedly stressed their openness to dialogue with all international partners, including the United States, and even in those moments when the United States of America demonstrated some absolutely strange approach. But each time we have said that we are ready to do all this with the understanding that this dialogue should be equal, honest, mutually respectful, and aimed at balancing interests, and not at unilateral diktat, pressure and threats. And have already commented today on the answer to a certain similar question, quoting the speech of the President of the Russian Federation, a recent one, I will not repeat it, regarding the fact that we have recorded the relevant statements of the elected, now entered into the powers of the American president, of such a constructive nature. Well, and then according to the quote. Thank you. And the second question. President Trump has decided to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement and the World Health Organization. How can you comment on this? Well, you know, there has been a joke going around for a long time that the only factor or the only point of predictability of the United States of America is its unpredictability. In other words, it is predictable in only one sense, that it is unpredictable, but perhaps in this sense, it just breaks this joke, because we can already predict that with all certainty, that international legal agreements that are concluded by one administration are not considered as such by another administration. Do you understand? And, so to speak, we have repeatedly said that the American political forces that come to power, it turns out, are not engaged in the implementation of democracy, but are implementing a kind of American democracy. What am I talking about? They do not represent the whole totality of the people, but, as it were, they conduct, lobby, or realize the interests of only one part of it. In other words, a decision is not made in aggregate, taking into account different opinions and the conclusion of some common denominator, but exclusively only within the framework of one or another group of lobbyists, politicians, individuals, the electorate, and so on. As for the US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, such a step by the new head of the Oval Office was just the same predictable. Like I said, it was obviously possible to draw such a conclusion here, because this is the second time. Due to the US withdrawal, the Paris Agreement will not cease to exist, and international activities in this area will continue. For our part, we consider the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Paris Agreement to be key international instruments of global climate content. Now about the second part of your question. Previously, the United States has already made attempts to withdraw from the World Health Organization. How did it end? At that time, all this was not crowned with success, because the disagreements on this issue were directly in the United States of America. Therefore, this position has been stated by the current president, but it remains to be seen how it will be formalized in legal terms at the country level, and then we will comment already. Let me remind you, the United States pays 22%, up to 22% of the WHO regular budget. In addition, they make voluntary contributions, including from non-state sources, and It is clear that in the event of the final withdrawal of the United States from WHO, which is the leader of international cooperation in the field of public health, such cooperation will simply be undermined. Of course, this prospect causes nothing but regret. We stand for the development, strengthening and deepening of cooperation in the field of healthcare. It is important that its main beneficiaries are the countries of the global south. The recent pandemic has confirmed that it is only possible to effectively deal with modern challenges. The health of the planet is possible only together. All those who professed a different approach either failed or changed their minds and began to unite. We will closely monitor developments related to the decision of the new U.S. administration to move in order to promptly present our position, considering that, I say again, this is not just a U.S. decision, but it is a U.S. decision that will have a direct impact on an international organization, the Organization of the UN system. Thank you. Thank you. Less than Earl, greater than is with us.
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon.
Hello.
We only have one question. On January 21st, former US Senator Marco Rubio was sworn in as Secretary of State, and in this regard, we would like to ask how likely are contacts between the new American Secretary of State and our Foreign Minister Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov, and how possible are contacts and any kind of interaction in this direction.
As you know, these contacts have not been discussed at the moment. Let's move on with us, Lee.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you. Liana Dalu is with us.
Yes, good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. We also have a question about Trump, though a little bit in the Middle East. The question is this. President Trump has lifted sanctions against Jewish settlers in the West Bank. How does Moscow assess this decision in light of the deteriorating situation in the West Bank?
Well, as the decision of the President of the United States of America. That's the only thing I can tell you. Probably, first of all, its regional sides, countries, residents, people should evaluate it. This is first of all, but this is the decision of the President of the United States. I say this again, maybe we will come back to this after some time, when the strategy as a whole will be clear, and it will not only be clear, but it will be supported by concrete steps, and there will be a general picture. Now, there are just such things as he promised, as us President Trump promised, just such fan signatures. It seems to me that a little more time is needed. I rarely say this phrase. It takes a little more time for such a general picture of the strategy of the United States of America in the Middle East to come to light. Many words have been said, concrete steps are just beginning. Let's wait for some such holistic picture.
And the second question. We are increasingly hearing a statement about a possible meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Trump. In this regard, the question arises whether the American side has requested contacts with the Russian foreign minister, with Sergei Lavrov.
So I just commented. Yes, I just answered a similar question. No. At the moment, this option has not been requested, or I don't even know how to answer the question. No. At the moment, there was no such thing.
Thanks for the answers.
Yes, as for the level of presidents, the presidential administration comments on us.
Thank you.
So thank you. With us or Ku TV. Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. With you, thank you. After the meeting of the foreign ministers of the Russian Federation of Armenia, I also expect that you will slightly open the veil of this 3-hour conversation. Is there any understanding that the Armenian side is ready to fulfill the conditions of the trilateral statement of November 10, 2017, which it currently ignores, that is, to unblock communications through the Zangezurza corridor? You know, I didn't hear. Maybe you can correct me. I didn't hear that. I didn't hear it either. No, I haven't finished with you yet. Maybe you haven't heard. I have not heard Yerevan officially say that it no longer considers itself a part of these documents. Accordingly, if there was no statement that they were not relevant, if there was no withdrawal from these signed statements, revocation of signatures, and so on, accordingly, the country is part, so to speak, of what its leader has declared. That's all I can say about your question. Thank you very much. Thank you. Leah Embassy Life is with us.
Maria Vladimirovna.
Yes, hello.
Yes, we have two questions. The first question: growing geopolitical divisions, deepening global inequality, a surge in violence against civilians, intolerance of other views, uncertainty caused by technological failures, and the multidimensional consequences of the climate crisis. All this has undermined the sense of justice and weakened confidence in international institutions. The inability of the current international system to find a solution to these more modern problems has further weakened an already fragile employee. And the question is, how does Russia assess the systemic problems of the multilateral order and promote dialogue on the restoration of diplomacy, which is rapidly changing in the international environment?
I believe that you have just announced the topic of your doctoral dissertation. This is how this question is posed on a large scale. Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, answered it in a pragmatic and very applied way, you know, with facts and arguments, during a press conference that took place in this hall a week ago. Of course, it is obvious. Well, I want to say again that this topic was fully disclosed, in my opinion, at the press conference. Of course, the main long-term trend is that the structure of the world is changing in the direction of multipolarity, and the United States, including the new administration, seems that such a world order is unprofitable for them, and for the sake of maintaining dominance, they intend to promote the concept stated about America and about the fact that it is above all, and that through force it is necessary to rule the world or achieve peace, and so on. But there are objective processes of life, or, better to say, historical development, and no one can turn the objective processes of the formation of a multipolar device around again. You can try to slow them down, but they are implemented not according to a political attitude or because of someone's desire, but simply because the economy is developing in this way, the historical reality is developing in this way. Because there was such a potential, because there is such a potential, because there are conditions for such a development of the world order. New major global players with a stable economic base, including self-sufficiency in natural resources, are striving to actively influence regional global processes. But first of all, they seek to dispose of their natural resources themselves. What distinguishes the current stage from the stage that we called colonialism? It's not just a matter of physical presence on Earth and substitution of their own state institutions, those that could be formed in the national capacity of a particular people. This management can be even without the presence on Earth of natural wealth, natural resources, other resources, of a particular nationality, people, territory, and so on. At this historical stage, there is a growing demand for a more stable system. This is supported by the states of the Global South and the East, which defend the values of sovereign equality of states and civilizational diversity. One of the key directions of the transformation of the world order is, of course, the establishment of new centers for making key decisions in many regions of the world, and our country participates in these processes and contributes to them. And our foreign policy is focused on constructive cooperation with all those who seek to create favorable conditions for national development, mutual respect, mutual benefit, on the basis of international law. Like most countries of the world, we do not accept the imposition of alien orders, incomprehensible rules on us. We oppose the hegemonic aspirations of individual countries, and we call on all countries to resolve disputes and resolve contradictions at the negotiating table by finding a balance of interests, without coercion and forced dictate. At the same time, we know how to stand up for ourselves when all this is violated. Our approaches, including those aimed at strengthening the foundations of multipolarity and sovereign equality of states, are not just widely supported by the world majority, they are in demand. They pin their hopes on us.
And the second question, it's small. The Fourth Diplomatic Forum, organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Turkish Republic, under the auspices of its representative in the office of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, will be held in Antalya on the 11th to the 13th of April 2025 year. This year's theme is the revival of diplomacy in a fragmented world. It reflects the urgent need for diplomacy to reassert itself as a stabilizing force, even in the face of growing global disagreements. Question: does the Russian Foreign Ministry plan to participate in this forum, and at what level?
As you know, high-ranking representatives of Russia regularly participate in this event. In March of the 24th year, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry spoke at a special session. The forum held in Antalya, Syria. Third-party contacts with foreign partners. We believe that this forum, this diplomatic forum, has established itself as an authoritative international platform within which topical issues of the international regional agenda are discussed. By the way, in answer to your previous questions, I want to say that remember how many, if we take 20 years ago, there were similar forms, up to one, and all of them are mostly either in Western Europe or, so to speak, somewhere across the ocean. And so everyone was sitting and waiting. And when will some kind of diplomatic forum, some kind of conference take place there somewhere in the NATO country? And now look at the number of sites that have already taken place in those countries, where such forums have not taken place before. The largest political science, international, and diplomatic forums are held in the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, China, India, and many other countries. They are no less and sometimes more ambitious. But the most interesting thing is that they are much more promising than those that have already been many decades old. Why? Because they see reality and they fix it. And they are not afraid to take off ideologized glasses, and many of them did not have them, and do not have them, and see how things really are, and not just methodically read out contrary to the laws. And I mean contrary to the laws of logic, and contrary to reality narratives, that someone has slipped them there. Now about the decision on the level and participation of representatives of our country. The decision on participation and the level of participation is being worked out. We will inform you about the results of its adoption.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is the author and with us?
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Yes, Ruslan Pankratiev is the author and by the way means insider. It will be easy for you to remember we have 2 questions today after completion.
I just have already started to write not with a dot, but and.
The central bank cannot forgive us for this. He's complaining they're because of this activity of ours. Well, I wanted to say thanks to our law enforcement agencies. They don't give offense, they comply with the law, so we have our own snacks there. Well, we continue to fight for justice and truth. We have 2 questions today, after our victory in Ukraine. after the completion and its completion? Who and how will repay the debts received there in loans for weapons to support the economy?
Well, here you are again. You want me to speak for someone. Now you are talking, as I understand it, about the Kiev regime. Yes. Do I understand correctly? Well, it seems to me that this is an issue that should be more concerned. I would even say, not the Kiev regime. He's already in a frenzy. Nothing bothers anyone there anymore without an appropriate dose. And first of all, it should concern those, and not even representatives of the elites in Western countries, because they know how to maneuver, but the citizens of these countries, who issue the appropriate loans, and whose money the whole banquet is on. And now this banquet will have to be maintained for even more money if the decision is implemented, which the Anglo-Saxons have already matured somewhere there, so that they eat, and Europe should pay in the form of the European Union as a country. So let them think. This is a question for them. The fact that the West doubts about getting their money back is confirmed by the absolutely fraudulent scheme agreed upon by the family group to use the proceeds from Russian sovereign state assets illegally blocked in Western jurisdictions, to implement agreements on the allocation of a loan to Ukraine in the amount of 45 billion euros, and in particular, the European Union promised to provide the Kiev regime with more than 18 billion euros in the 25th year. But, by the way, it is also interesting, Brussels, with all this, provides for a maximum 45-year repayment period of the loan, at the expense of income from Russian state assets again. It turns out that this whole scheme with the financing of the Kiev regime is already being laid down, such a temporary perspective, in which it will be impossible to ask anything from the persons currently operating in the West and in Kiev. What does it look like? I think this is very similar to the decision of the outgoing Biden administration, his personal decisions as President of the United States, to pardon even those relatives, with respect to their own, against whom there were no criminal cases, and there were charges. But just immediately take and pardon, well, just realizing that apparently everyone's snout is in fluff there. It's about the same here. Thus, who bears the credit burden? On the shoulders of the EU taxpayers and future generations of ordinary Ukrainians, who are being strenuously driven into this very debt pit. Those who are now making decisions on granting loans to Kiev are guided by understandable reasons, by getting hooked on the financial needle, to preserve the Nazi regime obedient to the West in Ukraine for the foreseeable future, and to ensure the possibility of free plundering of the resources remaining in this country, which is what they've been doing all this time. Due to the fact that Ukrainian citizens, who are traitors to their own people, were allowed to do this by adopting monstrous laws, taking loans, stealing instant loans, signing debt obligations right and left, and at the same time using the same money stolen from their own citizens, buying real estate abroad, vacationing, a bank, and so on. Well, there is more than enough information on the web. Do you know what strikes me? It amazes me that the citizens of Ukraine still remain there on the territory of Ukraine and support Zelensky. Or maybe they no longer support Zelensky, but simply associate themselves with what is happening there. It amazes me that they are still surprised when videos of their elites' luxury holidays abroad appear on the web. For some reason, this causes them some surprise. We have been talking about this for many years, talking about how the allocation of funds to supposedly help Ukraine from the European Union or the West is linked with the appearance of these buyers of wholesale luxury items in these same EU stores and salons. It's just a week. From a week to 10 days passed from the moment the loan was issued. Accordingly, he was driven through Kyiv. Regime banks, structures and some departments there came out, so to speak, in streams and streams to the relevant citizens and responsible persons in Ukraine, who actually sought it all, pulled it apart, cashed it, and so on. And they flew to the corresponding cities of Europe, but above all Europe, in order to shop. And they returned to themselves. Well, we've talked about it many, many times. Or put money in, not only to shop, but also to put money in their own bank.
Thank you. And the second question. What is the forecast situation on the gas market in the European Union after the termination of the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine?
Not only the gas market, but also the economy of the European Union countries as a whole will experience negative consequences from the actions of the Kyiv regime, and all because the termination of the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine is considered in Brussels exclusively through the prism of solving the political task of refusing to supply Russian energy resources to the European Union. In other words, the energy security, in other words, of individual EU member states, their sovereign choice in favor of one or another form of energy balance, and the obvious negative, destructive economic consequences for them are not actually taken into account. How they do it dichotomically, I do not know, but apparently you see such an installation. Brussels and European officials are trying and diligent in this. It is necessary to give the position, to assure everyone that they were carefully prepared for this event. There is no damage to the association, but that's what they said before too. Moreover, they said that they would only be able to increase their advantage if, as they said, they tamed Russia using Ukraine. Well, that's how they have increased, and in what place we see. To solve the problem of the loss of Russian gas supplies in transit through the territory of Ukraine, Brussels offers such, simple and already tested methods for Ukrainian consumers. By increasing the supply of significantly more expensive American liquefied natural gas and further savings measures. Well, as if everything is also clear here. What has it already led to there? It didn't lead to that. Well, as they said, you see, they didn't freeze. Well, it's certainly just deindustrialization has occurred. There was a break in many economic ties, and the washing out of business and European companies from the European continent. They just moved everything. Well, that's it. I mean, really, it's dozens or hundreds of the largest companies that have moved to the territory of the United States of America. It hit the development. That is, it's not about who is warmer or colder there. The question is that the development plans that the countries of the European Union had are no longer relevant. And all this has led, as I have already said, to a wave of deindustrialization on the European continent, and to a drop in the standard of living of the population. And I say this without malice and gloating. It's just a statement of fact. And we warned them, not that they were unaware. The European Commission is not going to stop there. It is actively working towards the final destruction of the EU's energy security. For example, by the end of February, it is planned to present a so-called roadmap on the complete disposal of Russian energy resources from Russian energy carriers. But we've seen a lot of insanity, yes, with them. You'll forgive me? Maybe it would be necessary to use another word somehow, but this is insanity. In the same way, at all times, the United States of America forced the whole of this Europe to salute. What do they call it? Multigender, or as it is a variety of acceptance, something like that. to hang out flags, to walk in these parades, to build legislation in one direction, to screw it everywhere, just forcibly screw the provision on gender into those documents that have never been related at all, even to the humanitarian dimension. The European Union, and not only, but also those who were close associates, who associated themselves with the policy of the European Union as simply, guinea pigs, meekly changed everything, perverted everything everywhere of some final, irrevocable kind. Everywhere they somehow adjusted to the USA. In 1 second, the United States of America simply got into the press by publishing, or partially, but by issuing the corresponding order of the State Department. They took themselves out of this game. In 1 second, everyone said it. We don't hang flags, we don't parade abroad. And who in this case we notice, from the employees of American embassies or us government departments, we will punish terribly. In 1 second. Do you understand? That's the same with energy. It's all the same. They were lined up, all these you people, in some kind of, zombie queue, and lead to the cliff. And these won't wake up in any way. Therefore, in February, it is planned to present, as I said, a roadmap on the complete disposal of Russian energy carriers. It seems to me that the next roadmap is the complete elimination of food from the EU. The roadmap is about complete liberation, getting rid of the mind of the EU people. These are the categories that will already be in effect. Thus, we are literally watching in real time how the European Union is breaking the foundation on which its well-being has been held for a decade with its own hands, and at the same time, they seem to not want or deny the existence of other poles and the growth of other centers of economic growth. And how will they not appear if they simply take Russian resources on the basis of equal interaction and use them, by the way, according to the schemes that the EU people used before for the benefit of their industry? So they get these new centers. The energy policy imposed by Brussels increasingly resembles just a rattling mixture of a hopeless experiment to accelerate the reduction of hydrocarbon consumption, and such a clear desire of the top of the EU bureaucracy to achieve a complete redistribution of the EU energy market in the interests of Washington. Such steps by European officials simply cannot but cause surprise. And our country, in turn, consistently stands for there is no alternative to constructive interaction between all interested parties on the basis of mutual respect and international law. Our actions in the global energy markets are traditionally aimed at maintaining global energy security, providing consumers with reliable modern energy sources, maintaining a balance of interests between buyers and producers of raw materials. Russia remains a reliable supplier of energy resources, faithfully fulfills contractual obligations. Our country is aimed at the progressive expansion of bilateral and multilateral cooperation with all partners. Therefore, we used to say that we hope that economic expediency will prevail there. It seems to me that there must be some kind of mind, still wake up and wake up. Well, it seems to me that their problems are already there.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Is the voice of the fatherland with us?
Yes, good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. You have already commented today on the buildup of the NATO naval group in the Gulf of Finland, in Estonia. Well, on this occasion, I want to clarify. NATO ships are gradually moving into the zone of the operation to protect shipping in the Baltic. And we see that even the use of non-crewed boats is planned there. In this regard, there is a certain concern among the residents of St. Petersburg. People are wondering what to expect and what are the potential risks from the actions of this NATO grouping for trade.
Well, your question is still more within the framework or introduction of the Ministry of Defense, because to a greater extent, you are not talking about what the enemies on the other side are doing, but about what we should do to ensure our defense capability and maintain our security. Accordingly, it is to our power unit, first of all, the Ministry of Defense, I think so, and globally, I described this picture, so to speak, and commented on it, and outlined it in the introductory part.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
The second question is more hypothetical. What will be the reaction of the Russian Federation to the change in the status of Canada, in particular, if the scenario of its integration by the United States of America is implemented?
Well, you said it right. A hypothetical scenario. Do you mean that a referendum on accession should be held in Canada, or what? This is a question for them. This is their reaction to the statement of the United States of America. This is their vision of their sovereignty, their independence. Therefore, it seems to me that this is still not a question for us. Speaking not hypothetically, but very objectively and concretely, Russia, as we have repeatedly said, adheres to the principles of equality laid down in the Charter of the United Nations, respect for the rights of peoples to self-determination, sovereign equality of the state, and ensuring territorial integrity. Those states whose governments behave decently, as Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov said, respect the rights of all nations inhabiting this country, and therefore represent the entire population living on their territory. But this is the basis, which I will remind you once again, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, at a conference on the results of the activities of Russian diplomacy for 2024 year.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? If there are no questions, and if you suddenly need any additional clarifications, please send them. We will respond promptly, as in fact, we have been doing all week. I'm saying goodbye to you until next time. Well-being.